Dr. Creston, it's Samantha Bragg. So this is my video for my PS500 fusion paper. The topic I chose to do was the post-Mubarak Egypt, and I wanted to touch on the effects of the revolution and the current policies that are in place regarding it. So the first section of my paper kind of goes over the threat that the post-Mubarak Egypt poses on the U.S. and the rest of the world. So from the Arab Spring and the ousting of the Mubarak regime in Egypt, it allowed for the world to kind of sit and watch while we were all waiting for Egypt's next move. Many of the Egyptian revolutionists pushed for a more democratic way of life, not necessarily one that reflected or mirrored the United States democracy, but one that allowed for more involvement in political decisions and the upholding of basic human rights. So interestingly enough, after the nation's first free and fair elections, the people chose to inaugurate an individual who belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood. This group is known for wanting to implement a purely Islamic state and who regards democracy as a type of wage of war on Islam. During the revolution, the real saving grace of Egypt was its military. The Supreme Council of Armed Forces, or SCAF as I'll call it later. Although it was technically employed by Mubarak, the pressure from Egyptian citizens and international actors caused it to remove its support from the dictator and also remove him from power. So SCAF assumed power during the interim after the fall of Mubarak, and although many felt as though SCAF was their protector, it maintained many of the oppressive aspects of the Mubarak era, despite the public's efforts for a more democratic push within the nation. It was also understood that once a new leader had been elected, SCAF would kind of remove itself from decision making. However, due to the fact that the election led to allowing the Muslim Brotherhood within the office, SCAF never really backed down. It could be argued that SCAF kept an Islamic group from taking over the country, but this group, SCAF, is the group that receives the U.S. funding and aid money, which could mean that their tactics were purely just self-interested and they could care less who's really in office as long as they're still receiving the funds. And given the amount of aid funding that is granted to Egypt, the U.S. is put in a complicated situation. It's hard to overlook the many human rights violations occurring, but it can't lose the partnership that it's built with Egypt due to the country's location, the strategic location. So the next section of my paper goes over current policy towards post-Mubarak Egypt. Like I said, they're still receiving relief funds. So the amount of aid relief that's provided to Egypt by the U.S. is the second largest that the U.S. provides. So while former administrations maintained the same foreign policy towards Egypt intended to turn the other cheek from any non-democratic situations, the Obama administration has announced its intent to put a greater emphasis on supporting democratic transitions and economic development within the region. Obama has even been quoting as instilling a new framework for U.S. policy in the region, which is based on securing stability, promoting reform, and integrating competitive markets with each other in the global economy. Given the events of the Arab Spring, many U.S. officials saw this as the opportune moment to place new conditions on aid that were in place in Egypt. So in 2012, we saw Congress attach the condition that the U.S. Secretary of State must first certify that Egypt actually held free and fair elections, and that it was protecting the civil liberties of its citizens, and that it was meeting conditions of the 1979 peace treaty with Israel before it allocated any foreign assistance to the nation. Although it seems like a step in the right direction, it kind of seems like it's a little late in the game to just now be implementing conditions on aid. And given that we're just now doing this, Egyptian officials have been quoted as stating that instilling these type of conditions that could hold back funds would be detrimental to any future cooperation from Egypt. And if the U.S. were to completely cancel its aid, it could potentially present the view that U.S. is abandoning the notion of democracy and reinforce the notion that it's been in cahoots with Mubarak this whole time. So the third section of this paper goes over post-Mubarak Egypt's effects on international organizations. So, as we talked about earlier, the free and fair election elected an individual from the Muslim Brotherhood. So the newly elected Morsi government wished to not reflect any of the policies from its predecessor, and it wasn't very fond of reducing fuel subsidies, like the IMF requested, should Egypt wish to receive any type of funding from the IMF. So Egypt began relying on domestic markets to finance the nation's deficit in order to secure continued support from its new constituents. It actually proved to be more expensive than relying on the international markets like they had once done. So negotiations between the IMF and Egypt have been described as on again, off again, due to the fear that any type of economic reform could be politically unpopular or that it could potentially cause more debt, which we see as not really happening because it proved that the international aid or using international markets is better than actually doing domestic markets. So the IMF isn't prepared to provide any funds unless Egypt exhibits necessary changes like the fuel subsidies. So even though Egyptian citizens may protest the subsidies, the IMF's lending policies prevent it from pursuing a program that doesn't have adequate conditionality commitments in place. So if Egypt were to reach an agreement with the IMF, it could potentially allow for the U.S. and other international organizations to further the crisis-stricken nation because they see that type of commitment to the IMF lending. So, alongside the attempted assistance from the IMF, the EU has also sought to help Egypt in its time of need. The EU offered technical support to election officials for both parliamentary and presidential elections. They also established the EU-Egypt Task Force in late 2012. And with this, it pledged an additional financial package of roughly £5 billion in grants, loans, and concessional loans. However, it was contingent on Egypt reaching an agreement with the IMF. So, along with the IMF and the EU, India is actually another international actor that has offered its assistance to Egypt. It's expressed its willingness to assist in drafting a constitution, setting up an election commission, and things of that sort. What I felt made this case of India's assistance so unique is that it really emphasizes civil and political rights, the same as it emphasizes economic, social, and cultural rights. Many will argue that the Western agenda tends to only stress on the civil and political rights and kind of neglects the economic, social, and cultural rights. So the next section of this paper provides suggestions for fixing Egypt, and these are purely scholarly suggestions. So after the revolutions in Egypt, the world was really eager to see what type of new institution and regime would be put into place once the uprisings had subsided. So naturally, those of us in the West, we really pushed for a democracy which reflected our own, while others in the Middle East argued for a more Islamist approach. Given that the election ended up with a less than desirable leader in place in our eyes, many felt that the U.S. should step in and help with the democratization process. Scholar Nathan Toronto suggests that what he calls it an active inaction. So this means that it would involve actively preparing the ground for eventual U.S. influence when the time is right, but it keeps a direct, overt engagement to a minimum in the short term. So he's arguing that the U.S. should continue to develop Egyptian military capacity and capability while encouraging it to become less beholden to whatever regime arises in Egypt. Excuse me. Many would agree that any type of assistance to the democratization of Egypt should be limited and shouldn't really attempt to build democratic institutions that reflect what the U.S. has. because the lifestyles, traditions, ethnic backgrounds of the country require an institution that accurately reflects them and not that of the U.S. or any Western nation for that matter. So the last section of my paper goes over how U.S. policy needs to change. So when creating or amending U.S. policy regarding Egypt, the U.S. really needs to take into account the lessons learned from previous situations. To give an example, in 2013, 43 employees of 4 different U.S. NGOs were convicted of conducting unauthorized operations within the country. However, the U.S. was well aware of the potential risks when it came to implementing democracy and governance assistance all the way back in 2005. So, if the U.S. knowingly implements programs in a nation that doesn't welcome them, it really hinders the relationship and risks maintaining the interests within the nation. So to kind of conclude everything, many applaud the U.S. for taking a step back and not attempting to immerse themselves any more than they had been regarding the democratization of Egypt. There is a fine line of what should be allowed as acceptable for the transitioning nation and what calls for reprimanding. It's definitely obvious that the relationship between the two nations, us and Egypt, have become a little more strained than what it was in previous years. However, I believe that U.S. policy must reflect a zero tolerance for human rights violations. And although assistance and aid is necessary in order to maintain the vital ally that is Egypt, this funding should never, ever overlook any violations or allow for another dictator-type regime to embed itself within the government. And lastly, the recent changes to U.S. foreign policy have definitely exhibited a step in the right direction. However, it must continue to move down this path and place the livelihood and desires of the people of Egypt before its own interest. So that's it for that paper. Hope you enjoyed this semester as much as I did, and I'll see you next semester. Thanks.